In the shadow of lengthening bread lines, American mothers faced an impossible daily arithmetic. They took the cheapest vegetable pulled from the frozen earth and turned it into a meal that kept entire families alive. The preparation method that ranks fourth in this historical record represents that exact survival strategy. The 18th method was packed into the tin lunchboxes of the men who built industrial bridges. The ninth approach fed neighbors who had nothing left to give. These 30 meals were designed for one strict purpose: survival. They fed people eating alone at kitchen tables that used to seat 6. Number 30. Ash-roasted cabbage cores. In the crowded boarding houses of Detroit, where auto workers shared beds and shifts, nothing was thrown away. The hard, bitter core of the cabbage, the part contemporary chefs toss into the compost bin, was a meal in itself. Mothers wrapped these dense centers in damp newspaper and buried them deep in the dying coals of the kitchen stove. They left them there for hours while the men went to the factory line. The slow, relentless heat broke down the tough fibers, turning something inedible into a soft, smoky mash. When pulled from the ash and dusted clean, it was served with a heavy pinch of salt and nothing else. It filled the belly and stopped the dull ache of hunger for another night. Today, high-end restaurants char cabbage over open flames and call it rustic gastronomy, but at the time, it was simply an act of making do. Number 29. Cabbage water broth. When the pantry held only dust and a single head of cabbage, the cooking liquid became a vital resource. After boiling the leaves for the adults, the pale green water left in the iron pot was never poured down the sink. Women in Chicago tenements poured this hot, slightly sulfurous liquid into tin cups for the children. They stirred in a heavy crack of black pepper and, if available, a single drop of grease saved in a jar on the windowsill. It was hot, and it offered the physical sensation of consuming a broth. Children drank it slowly, wrapping their freezing hands around the warm tin, perceiving it as a bowl of soup. It was a calculated illusion meant to quiet crying stomachs before bedtime, representing the raw arithmetic of poverty. Number 28. Skillet wilted outer leaves. The tough, dark green outer wrapper leaves were typically meant for livestock, but in the hardest years, families ate them first. They were too fibrous to eat raw and too leathery to simply boil. Instead, women sliced them into thin, ragged ribbons and threw them into a dry, scorching hot cast iron pan. With no butter or oil available, they relied on the unforgiving heat of the metal. The leaves hit the pan and hissed, blistering and turning black at the edges. Mothers scraped the bottom with wooden spoons, forcing the greens to soften through sheer friction and heat. Once wilted, a splash of vinegar was thrown in to cut the bitterness, a process that stung the eyes of anyone standing near the stove. It was harsh, aggressive food for a harsh time. It demanded heavy chewing and provided a stark reminder of survival. Number 27. Boiled cabbage stem stew. Beneath the leaves lay the thick, pale stalk, woody and unyielding. In a modern kitchen, it is discarded, but in a Depression-era home, it was the foundation of supper. The stalk was peeled of its toughest skin with a dull paring knife, then chopped into heavy blocks. It was dropped into a pot of rapidly boiling water and left to soften. It took hours of simmering on the back of the wood stove for the stalks to finally turn tender, taking on the texture of a poor man's potato. Served in shallow bowls with the cooking water, the chunks were mashed with the back of a fork to make them seem larger. Mothers drank the broth and gave the solid pieces to the working men, giving everything they had to keep their family alive. Number 26. Cabbage and cornmeal mush. When the wind blew the topsoil away in Oklahoma and Texas, families packed everything into old trucks, carrying their cast iron skillets with them. In those rusted pans, mothers utilized the coarse, yellow cornmeal handed out by government relief under Herbert Hoover's policies. They boiled it in water until it turned thick and heavy, then folded in thin, pale shreds of cabbage grown in whatever patch of dirt survived the drought. The cabbage yielded to the heat, melting into the porridge. They stirred slowly, scraping the bottom as the mixture bubbled and spat like mud. It tasted of earth and raw starch, but it expanded in the stomach, creating a dense, heavy warmth that convinced children they had eaten a full meal. Number 25. Potato and cabbage mash. A single backyard cabbage could not stretch across a family of 7, but a sack of government surplus potatoes altered the equation. Mothers peeled the bruised, knobby potatoes and boiled them until they fell apart in the cloudy water. Into this starchy bath, they dropped handfuls of roughly chopped cabbage, letting the greens boil down until they lost all resistance. Everything was mashed together with a heavy wooden spoon, scraping every last drop of moisture from the sides of the pot. No butter softened the dish, and no milk thinned it out. Just the starchy glue of the potato bound the bitter cabbage into a pale, filling paste. It sat heavy in the gut like a stone, ensuring the children would not wake up crying from hunger in the middle of the night. Number 24. Stale bread and cabbage hash. Bread lines stretched around city blocks, and the loaves that made it home were never thrown out. Even when they turned hard as wood, women in drafty kitchens took those stale crusts and soaked them in water until they turned to a dense paste. They threw shredded cabbage into a dry pan, letting it blister and wilt before dumping the wet bread on top. They stirred slowly, letting the starch coat the greens, forming a sticky, filling mass that steamed in the cold kitchen air. It smelled like yeast and boiled greens, heavy, desperate food, meant to plug the hollow ache in a working man's stomach before he went to look for jobs that did not exist. Contemporary chefs classify bread and vegetables as a rustic panzanella, but a century ago, it was simply supper. Number 23. Cabbage and drop dumplings. When the government relief sacks ran low and only a dusting of white flour remained, mothers stretched it with nothing but water and salt. They pinched the sticky dough into small, uneven lumps and dropped them into a pot where a quarter head of cabbage simmered in its own pale broth. The flour swelled in the hot water, turning into dense, chewy pockets of pure starch that absorbed the faint, grassy flavor of the greens. Children sat at the table, picking out the heavy dumplings, chewing slowly to make the meal last longer. It was a dish that asked for almost nothing but heat and time. The starch tricked the mind, and the cabbage sustained the body. Nobody went to bed completely empty in those dark years. They simply ate what they had to survive, knowing tomorrow would be the exact same. Number 22. Root cellar, salted cabbage. Before winter froze the ground solid in Ohio, survival meant looking ahead. Families took the last of the autumn cabbage harvest and shredded it fine, packing it into heavy stone crocks in the damp darkness of the root cellar. They threw in handfuls of coarse salt, working it into the greens with bruised knuckles until the water released. Then came the heavy clunk of a river stone placed on top to keep the cabbage submerged. It sat in the dark, bubbling quietly, fermenting into something sour and sharp. By February, when the pantries were bare, that crock was the only thing standing between a Midwest family and scurvy. It required no icebox, no electricity, only patience, a method of preservation that industrial food manufacturers later sought to replace. Number 21. Skillet fried sour cabbage. The fermented cabbage from the cellar was a lifeline, but eating it cold every day chipped away at a person's physical endurance. Mothers scooped out a heavy handful of the pale, sour ribbons, squeezing the cold brine through their fingers, and threw it into a hot cast-iron pan. The sharp, vinegary smell of cooking kraut filled small houses in Pennsylvania, seeping into the wallpaper and the heavy wool winter coats. They let it fry until the edges turned a deep, caramelized brown, adding nothing but black pepper. The intense heat mellowed the bite, turning the harsh fermentation into a rich, savory depth that tasted almost like meat. It was a hot meal that cost absolutely nothing, warmed the kitchen, and kept the winter at bay. Number 20. Cabbage brine bread. The harsh reality of the Depression kitchen meant realizing that even the liquid left in the crock was usable calories. When the last strands of salted cabbage were scraped out, a cloudy, sour brine remained at the bottom, and not a single drop was poured out. Mothers took the hardest, most unyielding crusts of stale bread and submerged them in the salty liquid. The bread swelled, acting like a sponge, soaking up months of fermented flavor and salt. It was eaten cold, straight from a tin plate, offering a sharp shock to the system that woke up tired muscles. while contemporary dietitians recommend fermented juices for gut health. In 1933, it was the primary way a family acquired essential vitamins. Number 19. Jar-pickled cabbage stalks. Even the toughest parts of the harvest were preserved against the coming freeze. The thick, woody stems that most would throw to the hogs were chopped into heavy blocks and shoved tightly into glass mason jars. Women poured boiling water, a pinch of salt, and a splash of sharp white vinegar over the top, sealing the lids tight. These jars lined the dusty shelves of Midwest root cellars, waiting silently while the snow piled high against the windows. Months later, when fresh food was unavailable, a jar was cracked open. The stalks had softened in the acid, offering a sharp, loud crunch that broke the monotony of mushy winter stews. It was a harsh, acidic bite that served as a physical reminder that spring would eventually return. Number 18. Lard-fried cabbage. Deep in the roaring steel mills of Pittsburgh, a man needed 4,000 calories a day just to survive the heat and heavy lifting. But meat was a luxury no one could afford. Instead, wives packed tin lunchboxes with a meal that cost less than $1.50 to make for the entire week. They melted thick blocks of pure white lard in a roaring hot cast iron pan and threw in mountains of shredded cabbage. The greens cooked down, absorbing every single drop of the rendered fat, transforming into dense, heavy fuel. Men ate it cold, sitting on steel beams, letting the grease coat their stomachs to fight off the gnawing ache of a 12-hour shift. While modern dietary guidelines would advise against this intake ratio, in 1934, it provided the necessary energy to build industrial infrastructure. Number 17. Coal yard cabbage pockets. Men laying track for the American railroads needed food. They could eat with filthy, grease-stained hands without forks or plates. Women rolled out a stiff, heavy dough of flour and water, stretching it over their knuckles. They stuffed the center with boiled cabbage and leftover potatoes, folding it over and pinching the edges shut into a tight seal. Baked until it formed a hard, brown crust, this hand pie acted as its own lunchbox. The thick shell protected the soft, starchy filling from the soot and coal dust of the rail yards. The men ate the inside and threw the dirty crust away, utilizing it not as a delicate pastry, but as a caloric vault. Number 16. The raw cabbage sandwich. When the lard ran dry and the fire went out, the lunchbox held only the barest essentials. A man walked to the factory floor with 2 thick slices of stale, dark bread, holding nothing but a wedge of raw cabbage and a single slice of sharp white onion. There was no butter to soften the bite and no meat to provide caloric density. Mothers salted the cabbage heavily, knowing the sodium would replace what the men sweat out in front of the blast furnaces. The crunch was loud and startling, breaking the monotonous drone of the machinery. The sharp, aggressive bite of the raw onion burned the back of the throat, shocking exhausted men awake for the final hours of their shift. Number 15. Bacon grease cabbage gravy. Real bacon was an economic impossibility, but the grease left behind from prior years was guarded like a liquid asset. Mothers kept an old coffee tin next to the stove, saving every precious drop of rendered fat. At dawn, they heated a single spoonful until it smoked furiously, tossing in rough chunks of cabbage. They fried the greens hard, then whisked in a dusting of flour and a splash of well water, stirring fiercely until it formed a thick, heavy brown gravy. Poured directly over a piece of hard bread inside a lunch pail, it sat heavy in the stomach. When an industrial worker ate it hours later, the lipid content provided the distinct sensory profile of meat, sustaining the family through another labor cycle. Number 14. Skillet seared cabbage steaks. During the deepest economic contractions of the era, and later when the government urged families to observe meatless Tuesdays, American housewives became masters of culinary substitution. A single head of cabbage was placed on a scarred wooden board, and a dull knife sliced it into thick, heavy slabs. They threw these rounds into a smoking hot cast iron skillet greased with whatever drippings remained in the pantry. Mothers let the cabbage sit undisturbed until the edges charred black and the center turned a deep, caramelized brown. It hissed and smoked, filling the kitchen with a savory, roasted scent that mimicked the olfactory profile of a heavy cut of beef. Served on a plate with a knife and fork, it was a structural imitation of a Sunday roast that provided dignity when resources were absent. Number 13. The stretched depression loaf. When a quarter-pound of ground beef had to feed a family of 6, mothers turned to the official home economics booklets distributed by the government. The manuals provided instructions on how to stretch a single piece of meat until it was almost entirely vegetable. They chopped cabbage so fine it resembled coarse ground chuck, tossing it into a bowl with the beef and a handful of raw onions. The cabbage vanished into the meat as it baked, absorbing the beef fat and turning dark in the heat of the oven. When sliced, it looked dense and rich, offering the visual and textural illusion of abundance. Children consumed the heavy slices, extracting the beef juices trapped inside the greens, unaware they were eating mostly backyard cabbage. Number 12. Marrow-soaked cabbage boil. The butcher shop was a place of economic reality, where a mother would ask for the bare bones typically reserved for livestock. She carried a single, jagged beef bone home and dropped it into a massive pot of boiling water. The slow heat extracted the hidden marrow and rendered fat into the cloudy broth. Then came the cabbage, roughly chopped and thrown into the rolling boil. The greens soaked up the faint grease, transforming from a cheap vegetable into a carrier of heavy animal proteins. The bone itself became the structural foundation for the next 3 meals, boiled again and again until it was white and chalky. Number 11. False beef skillet hash. In scenarios where there was no bone, no animal fat, and no government relief, households relied on a single bruised onion and a half-wilted head of cabbage. Women sliced the onion paper thin and threw it into a hot pan, letting it scorch and brown until the chemical breakdown of sugars released a deep, heavy aroma. They dumped the shredded cabbage on top, stirring fiercely to scrape the dark, roasted onion bits from the iron. The cabbage took on a rich, golden color, mimicking the visual appearance of browned hamburger meat. The smell of the caramelized onion wrapped the bitter greens in the scent of a phantom roast, allowing mothers to serve hot meals to exhausted workers under severe financial constraints. Number 10. Hooverville communal stew. When the banks collapsed, families lost their homes and gathered in sprawling shantytowns made of tin and cardboard on the edges of Chicago and New York. Private dinners ceased to exist. Instead, a massive, dented steel pot sat over a communal fire. Anyone who acquired a scrap of food deposited it into the water. But the bulk of the pot was universally cabbage. It boiled for hours, breaking down into a pale, endless broth that fed dozens of displaced individuals shivering in the cold. A single head of cabbage, stretched with river water and salt, fed 8 people for under $1 using adjusted ingredient pricing. It was a watery, thin liquid that tasted of smoke and bruised vegetables, sustaining populations long before factory canned soups dominated the market. Number 9. The neighborhood charity boil. In the freezing winters of 1931, the famous soup kitchens of New York and Chicago reached maximum capacity, leaving thousands standing in the snow with empty bowls. Mothers in the tenement buildings engineered their own localized distribution networks. When a woman noted her neighbors experiencing severe caloric deficits, she filled her largest laundry boiler with water and started chopping cabbage. She added heavy pinches of black pepper to create a burning sensation in the throat, replicating the thermal warmth of a heavy meal. Women operating with absolute zero margins still managed to feed entire floors of their buildings with a single, massive pot. The broth was ladled into cracked mugs and passed through dimly lit hallways as a calculated act of community survival. Number 8. The overnight bean and cabbage stretch. A handful of dried navy beans was cheap, but their dense cellular structure required precious fuel to cook. Mothers soaked them in a bowl on the kitchen counter for a full 24 hours until they swelled and softened. They were deposited into a heavy pot of boiling water alongside roughly chopped ribbons of cabbage. As the beans finally broke apart in the heat, their starch thickened the water, turning a thin cabbage broth into a dense, cloudy soup. The complex carbohydrates sat heavy in the stomach of a worker who had walked 10 miles looking for employment. The natural sugars of the legumes neutralized the bitter edge of the greens, creating a dense thermal mass that sustained families through freezing nights. Number 7. The macaroni and cabbage stretch. When government relief boxes included a small paper sack of dried macaroni, boiling the pasta by itself was considered a waste of physical volume. Mothers filled a large cast iron pot with water, throwing in a mountain of shredded cabbage until the greens boiled down into a soft, yielding mass. Only then did they introduce the limited quantity of hollow pasta. The macaroni swelled in the cabbage-infused water, absorbing the faint, grassy flavor and doubling its original size. A massive pot that could feed an entire family for a week sat simmering on the back of the wood stove. Children scraped the bottom of their bowls, hunting for the soft noodles hidden among the endless green ribbons, relying on the pasta to trick the eyes, while the cabbage filled the stomach. Number 6. The coal miners' cabbage and noodles. In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, the olfactory profile of this meal was a universal indicator of a working-class household. Eastern European immigrants brought the blueprint deep into the coal camps, and it rapidly became an American survival staple because the raw materials cost next to nothing. Women threw massive handfuls of shredded cabbage into a black iron skillet, frying it hard in saved grease until the edges underwent Maillard browning. They tossed in heavy, dense egg noodles, letting them fry until they absorbed the ambient lipids. It was heavy, grease-laden, and packed with the immediate caloric density a man needed to swing a pickaxe underground for 10 consecutive hours. Number 5. The Appalachian potato and cabbage mash. Irish families fleeing famine brought the structural memory of Colcannon across the ocean, but the Great Depression stripped the formula of its butter and heavy cream. Mothers in company towns boiled potatoes until they shattered in the water, mashing them into a dense paste with the back of a wooden spoon. They folded in boiled ribbons of backyard cabbage, heavily salted and peppered, turning the dish pale green. Lacking dairy to thin the emulsion, they relied entirely on the starchy cooking water. The distinct sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of the iron pot signaled that the single caloric intake event of the day was ready. Number 4. The unstuffed cabbage bake. This preparation method kept entire demographics alive when local supply chains ran completely out of meat. Slavic immigrants held the technical knowledge of rolling ground pork and rice into delicate cabbage leaves, but by 1933, pork was economically inaccessible. American mothers adapted the architecture of the dish. They chopped the cabbage into rough squares, layering it in a deep baking dish with handfuls of cheap white rice and a thin liquid base made from canned crushed tomatoes. It baked for hours until the rice absorbed the ambient moisture and the cabbage melted into a soft carbohydrate pudding. It carried the structural memory of the old country, mathematically altered to fit the brutal constraints of the new economy. Number 3. The Pennsylvania Dutch skillet, sweet and sour. German immigrants settling in the Midwest imported a cooking methodology designed to trick the stomach into recognizing satiety without the presence of animal protein. When the pantry inventory dropped to a single wilted cabbage and a few bruised orchard apples, mothers initiated this specific protocol. They shredded both ingredients and threw them into a hot skillet with a splash of cheap cider vinegar. The acetic acid cut directly through the heavy sulfur compounds of the greens. It cooked down into a soft, dark reduction that families scooped up with pieces of stale bread, relying on the fructose in the rotting fruit to provide an immediate energy spike to exhausted nervous systems. Number 2. Salted raw cabbage wedges. When the firewood supply was completely exhausted and the stove went entirely cold, thermal cooking became a physical impossibility. In unheated tenement apartments, mothers executed the final available protocol, cutting a raw head of cabbage into thick wedges and dusting them heavily with sodium chloride. The raw cellulose structure of the plant took an agonizingly long time to break down in the mouth, forcing the jaw muscles to work continuously. This prolonged mastication process served a physiological purpose, occupying the digestive system for extended periods while the sodium helped retain water in malnourished bodies. It was not a culinary preparation, but a baseline mechanical action designed to sustain biological function in sub-zero environments. Number 1. the backyard dirt boil. During the most severe economic contractions of the Great Depression, when government relief trucks ceased distribution and domestic supply chains collapsed entirely, survival depended strictly on what could be extracted directly from the frozen topsoil. Women walked into sub-freezing wind currents, ripped the last stunted cabbages from the frost-hardened dirt, and boiled them whole in a pot of untreated well water. The preparation contained absolutely zero added sodium and zero rendered fat, utilizing nothing but baseline thermal heat and raw agricultural residue. Archival journals from individuals who operated through that decade document the exact same historical reality. That boiling pot of pale green water was the singular variable preventing total starvation. It was not a formulated recipe, but a desperate physiological intervention. The strict caloric rationing, executed within those small, freezing kitchens, ultimately sustained the foundational workforce of the nation through its most severe economic collapse.